we're live. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Agne, product owner here at Doc Labs, and I'll be your host for the next hour. So before we get into the session, a quick note, like always, so we'll have time for live Q&A at the end, but feel free to drop in your questions in the chat as we go. I do sometimes add audience questions as we go through the conversation. I think it kind of livens it up a little bit as well. And also, please drop a message in chat now saying where you're listening from. It makes us feel a bit more responsible not to ramble on too much when we know that there's actually real people listening in. So today, we're tackling a question that does sound straightforward, or like not for me at first, but I have read a lot before the webinar to make sure that I can keep up. So the question that we're talking about today is, can you really have zero trust if your identity architecture is still built on perimeter-based trust models? And most organizations say that they're doing zero trust, but many still rely on trusted internal networks, trusted systems, and trusted assumptions baked into their identity stack. And that gap is what we're here to dig into. And to do that, I'm joined by two people who know the space very well. So first, we have Richard Esplin. He's a head of product here at Doc Labs, where he leads the Trevera identity platform. He spent 2 decades in senior product roles across digital identity and open space, including time at Evernym and Gen. And I'm especially excited to welcome Justin Richard. Not that I don't like talking to Richard, but I talk to him all the time, so it's nicer to have someone new. Justin is a senior staff engineer at MongoDB, leading identity engineering for their Atlas Cloud platform. Justin has been contributing to identity standards for over 20 years, including OAuth, GNAP, and US federal identity standards published by NIST. He co-authored OAuth in Action and was recently named one of the 2026 Identity 25 by Octave Ventures. He's well known for being patient at explaining technical concepts to people who haven't done all their homework, like Richard. So Richard, Justin, thank you for joining me. Really glad to have you both here. We will start this with Richard sharing some slides and explaining zero trust architecture, and then we'll go into the questions that we have, and then of course the audience questions. So now the stage is all yours, Richard.
Thank you, Agne. I appreciate that. And for our audience who joins regularly, we always appreciate your questions and your comments. We've had a series of webinars recently about architecture. How do we structure our identity architecture? How do we make sure that it's flexible and can adapt while still being secure? And so this continues that conversation. In March, we published a blog post that laid out a lot of these ideas. And as we were discussing it, I met Justin, I think at IW at the Internet Identity Workshop. And I always enjoyed, Justin, that I could ask you all these questions and you just had a depth of knowledge. And I thought, if I could talk about this and get feedback from somebody, it'd be you. And so thank you for offering to have this conversation in public where other people can benefit. And I think the audience is going to find your insights to be really valuable. So we're going to start.
Thank you very much for having me on today. I appreciate it.
Excellent. Very good. So we're going to start with a level set, just a couple of minutes. Let's talk about what is zero trust architecture, so we're all talking about the same thing. In the 1990s, as everybody connects to the internet, we realized that firewalls aren't a sufficient defense. And we start to have academics put together mathematical models for trust where they try to quantify and try to say, oh, places where zero trust is required is the ideal security posture. And then in 1994, there's a Network World article that talks about the challenges of firewall security when you connect to the internet, because this is all brand new. And a Sun engineer says, well, one of the challenges with firewall perimeter defense, is that you end up with a hard shell and a soft center, like a Cadbury egg. I love that metaphor. And so people read this article, they challenge connecting their organizations to the internet and start talking on the internet about best practices. And so in the early 2000s, a group called the Jericho Forum, that's now the part of the Open Group Security Forum, still fairly prominent group of security practitioners. They talk about deperimeterization, getting rid of this idea that you have a hard boundary with the rest of the world, and instead recognize that you need defense in depth, that your firewall shouldn't be your only defense. And this is keyed off of by a security researcher who joins Forrester and publishes an article called No More Chewy Centers, where he talks about zero trust model of information security. And he keys off of a political term from nuclear disarmament where we say trust but verify. He keys off it by saying verify and never trust, which oftentimes people say now is to always verify, never trust, or never trust, always verify. Now, Google's adopted a lot of these practices in this period of time. And in 2014, they go public with a set of best practices around their adoption of zero trust principles. And that's on a website called Beyond Corp. They call it the Beyond Corp Initiative. And that website's maintained today and still has a lot of great resources for practitioners who want to learn more about zero trust. And then we see this become best practice. That Forrester and Gartner and other analysts start promoting this as the standard way to do things. And it starts to get built into formal standards. First with the NIST in the United States, who publishes 800, NIST SP 800, that defines zero trust architecture, and then becomes a requirement through an executive order to the US federal government. And then that gets rolled into ISO 27000, which is cloud security controls. So 27001 talks about general controls, 27002 maps those controls to zero trust principles. And then the European Union adopts this in their directive in 2022. And then again, in 2025, it moves from just being, common trust principles to being an actual, recommendation for zero trust architecture. Now, the challenge with all these different formulations of zero trust is everyone describes it differently. So I'm going to stick with NIST 800 because it has 7 principles that are easy to describe. But I do want to express gratitude for the OWASP. Their security principles that come out of OWASP are very helpful for practitioners. And their cheat sheet for NIST 800 really summarizes it well. So the 7 principles are that all data sources and computing services need protection. Don't assume that just because something's internal, in quotes, to your network that it's safe. That because of that, all communication should be secured. Just because it comes from a, quote, trusted service doesn't mean that you can send it in clear text. It should still be encrypted, and you should still authenticate it, regardless of location and origin. And then when we give access, we don't want long-lived accounts. We don't want permanent tokens or permanent keys. We want session tokens, and we want as short a period as possible for the authentication and to grant it on least privilege to provide the minimum access needed for them to achieve their goal. And then we can have this policy be dynamic to be able to measure other factors. Is it coming from an unexpected location? Is it accessing an unexpected resource? Is it coming at an unexpected time? And when these things happen, then we can say, oh, this is more of a concern. Maybe we block it. Maybe we limit it. Maybe we require a second factor and do this in a dynamic way. Now, that does require monitoring and measuring. We always want to know all the endpoints in our system. Are they patched? Are they up to date? And track our users. When was the last time that, password security and second factor onboarding, all those kind of things. And then we can take this monitoring and measuring, and we can provide that authentication authorization policy in a dynamic way and strictly enforce it. So these are made in real time. Our systems can look and say, based on the factors that we're measuring for security and based on device health, we can enforce separate policies in order to make the ground always shifting for the attacker and make it hard for them to get in. And then, of course, we want to collect that information in order to improve. Now, the 2025 European Union directive around computer security, I really like. They use what they call they introduced the zero trust Kipling methodology, which is a play off of Rudyard Kipling's poem. 6 honest serving men, they taught me all I knew. Their names are what and why and when and how and where and who. So you're always thinking about these questions, the 6 questions that give you an idea about why you're doing this. And then there's this iteration. You define your surface you're going to protect. You figure out the flows that go within that, between those resources. Then you build your architecture, you create that policy that you can enforce dynamically, you monitor and maintain, and that allows you to refine your protected surface, and you start over that process. So we got to always innovate, we got to always iterate, because the bad guys are trying to do the same. So that's just a really quick level set of definitions and philosophy. Hopefully you find that useful. I'm sure most of our audiences are familiar with these things, but it was useful for me to get a broader overview. And what I'm struck with as I look at all this is this has been around for a long time and it's still so unnatural. Why do we struggle with this? And frequently we'll set up a zero trust architecture for our environment, but then we plop into the middle of it an IAM directory and say, okay, everybody needs to access this IAM directory in order to get access to all the applications. But that puts the IAM directory kind of on the edge of the boundary. It's the gatekeeper for everything. But then we say, oh, we don't want it on the internet. It's a juicy target. It has all of our identity data. So we're going to protect it with a firewall. And we're going to say, these are the applications that can access the IAM directory. And anything outside of that can't. And now we're back to that castle and moat architecture. We're back to saying, here's our perimeter, our hard perimeter and our soft chewy center. And of course, to get access to that perimeter, to get a new application set up inside the trust boundary, you got to go through all the requirements. Are you secure? Are you up to date? How does it fit into our monitoring? And then, of course, some team says, oh, I need to set up my new marketing email service. And I can't wait 2 months to get this done. And so then they set it up outside the boundary. And suddenly there's a mess.
Yeah, and this, I think, illustrates sort of the start of what I think is one of the most important things about zero trust is that you have to ask zero trust in what? What is it? What part of this are you saying you have zero trust in? Because if you look back at the original sort of coiners of the phrase, they were saying zero trust in the local network. And so fundamentally, they were looking at systems that were saying like, oh, it's on the LAN, so we don't need to protect it because only good people can get to the LAN. And so as soon as an attacker gets access to the LAN, everything is just wide open and available. I actually remember having arguments with folks back in the early 2000s about that very topic, is that like, oh, we don't have to encrypt our LDAP traffic because it's on the LAN, and therefore it's all just kind of, up and running. That's totally fine. And it's only for local corporate applications in a company of like 8,000 people. And so like, it's totally trusted and we don't need to encrypt everything and it's fine. And so to me, the first and most important question of zero trust is, which part are you putting your zero trust in? And this is really kind of showing that like where you're drawing that boundary, as I know we're going to get into, where you're drawing that boundary is helping you answer that question of what is the piece that you're not putting trust in.
Absolutely. And that's, I completely agree. And we did an exercise over the last few months where, or I guess it was more than a quarter ago now, where we interviewed a bunch of IAM architects. And that was exactly answering that question for their enterprise was one of the challenges they kept raising. The business needs are always changing. The applications that need to be protected are always changing. The information that needs to be shared is always changing. And trying to keep pace with that evolution becomes very hard, which is why they default back to having that perimeter, because it allows them flexibility within, but is not very secure. And so frequently the approach to this is to set up a second directory. And then you say, oh, look, this directory is just going to have a shard of the main directory, and it's just going to work for a specific application. We can set up a synchronization tunnel between these two, and that way we can have a set of applications that don't follow the same rules as the others. But suddenly the second one might not be too bad. The fourth one kind of gets painful. The 10th one gets impossible. It just spreads, and then the synchronization breaks. And then what do you do? Because how do you get that resynchronized? Or you say, oh, I need a new piece of data synchronized. Well, how do we get that permission? And that requires changing the main IAM directory, which then can impact all the applications that are using it. And it gets very brittle is where this happens. But it is the common paradigm. We've all done it. It's the natural way to go.
It is. And another place where you see this a lot if you're working in enterprise spaces is when you have different business units or different acquisitions. I see this in in companies getting acquired a lot of the time. They will set up this little sync in between sort of the mothership and the acquired company in order to keep everything copied over at all times. So now you just have one gold source, except that every gold source, every copy of it is treated as if it were the gold source. And you're not really, with this type of setup, which is, desirable for a lot of practical reasons, because, it's pretty easy to set this up from a technology standpoint. You're actually diluting your trust throughout the whole system. You're not really isolating anything in something like this, and it creates that brittleness that Richard was just talking about.
Yep, absolutely. So what do? Is a verifiable credential person, being at Truvera, I should say before we get to that point. So people look at this and they say, oh, well, this is not secure. How do we secure this? And the answer is, well, we need to make sure every application is accessing the centralized IAM directory in a secure way. And we need to follow these principles of monitoring and of being dynamic and of unifying those directories. And this works. There are companies who have done this, but it can be very hard. And it makes that IAM directory even less flexible to that point. So then what do? Well, I see the benefit when we introduce a user wallet. And of course, most of us, we might not call it a wallet, but we have that second factor application. Most of us are already using an application to get access to everything. By putting our user data on that application, on the mobile device, or maybe we do it in the cloud, then that IDP moves from being the center of everything to being the identity proofing server. So we go to the IAM directory, we prove who we are, we get the information that needs to be trusted, and then we take that with us to these different applications. And what I find to be the really interesting idea here is that the way that the verifiable credentials is built is this is an untrusted wallet. We're not trusting the user's device. And so every time we get information out of the user's wallet, we have to re-authenticate it. We have to say, oh, is it signed by the trusted authority? Does it contain the information? Has it been tampered with? Credentials build all this trust in. And so each of these interactions are, quote, zero trust by default. And so then the applications can then go through and read that information and make their decision. Now, what I was thinking as I was preparing this yesterday is I really should have provided like a cloud around this that says, oh, you probably have all this tied into a policy framework. So you do have centralized policies, but the data that needs to be trusted doesn't have to be centralized. And so then you can pull that in, and application A can make different decisions than application B because it pulled different data. And introducing a new piece of data doesn't break everything because it's just another credential and it doesn't impact the credentials you're already using.
And I would actually like to push back a little bit on the wallet being untrusted in the system because it is trusted, but that trust is established in a transitive way and in a largely, in many architectures, transient way. So that the carrier of this issued credential doesn't have to be a highly trusted, previously known component in most use cases. There are, of course, use cases where you do want to have that kind of information. And so one of the documents that I helped work on with NIST was NIST 800-63. Previously, we were talking about 800-207. The SP series is absolutely massive. There's literally hundreds of documents there. But 800-63 talks about the fact that in this case, the applications are actually trusting the IDP here. The thing that is issuing, or what NIST would term the credential service provider, or CSP. They are trusting that to have done its homework when it issues something into a wallet. And that might include the CSP saying, oh, hey, I don't trust this particular bit of wallet software, it's the user's decision whether or not I've trusted this wallet software, or maybe it comes from a consortium or some other federation authority or some other mechanism that the applications can then use as part of their calculus, importantly, in deciding what do I do with the information that is being presented to me now.
Yeah, I think that's a really useful piece of insight. And And that's why we see things like the European Union Digital Identity doing wallet certification to make sure that we're only dealing with wallets that the citizen can be confident isn't stealing their data. But what's nice about here is that all of that gets built into the system, and we as identity practitioners, we don't have to really think about that. We recognize we need to understand the trust profile of that IAM directory that's doing the identity proofing, because that becomes the root for our ecosystem. But the wallet that's getting used, the way the data moves between the wallet and the application, that all builds in the verification, and we don't have to do SSL certificate pinning. We don't have to do all these complicated things that we did when we were trying to implement zero trust on a per application basis. So excellent. I appreciate the insight, Justin. Now, one of the pieces of feedback we frequently get, though, is that this is a big change. Every application has to start talking to wallets. But you don't really need every application to talk to wallets. As we discussed in our last webinar, I encourage people to watch, you can use that wallet just to move between the directory domains. We introduce, instead of trying to synchronize the first directory and the second directory and manage all the trust related to that and keeping all the data synchronized, when a user is moving between those domains, we put it in their wallet, and then they move to the next domain and present it. That introduces the flow to the user. It simplifies the federation. And when we onboard new applications, then we can work directly with that wallet. And over time, we can start to deprecate the IAM specific integrations. So the directories then become issuers and verifiers, but the applications don't have to see this change in architecture because the IAM directory is hiding that change. So that's the main shift that we're advocating for here. And we recognize, I put this in terms of verifiable credentials because, that's what we do at Truvera. But what we're really talking about is a design pattern for flexibility. It's not, there's no single approach to do this. I love, Justin, as I was preparing for this, I watched your recording about identity bubbles, and it's kind of the same idea. We're moving data between the bubbles. We're shifting from thinking about accessing the directory to thinking about moving data in a network. And I love your metaphor. Eventually, bubbles become a foam that's very resilient and adaptable and secure in each little domain. That's the change in thought we're talking about here. And so we use the term in Truvera about moving credentials becomes an ecosystem of trust. And then you can have these very dynamic ways of saying, oh, I trust this issuer for this information and that issuer for that information. And you're not tied into saying, okay, I need to get in line for my data element to be added to the IDP because that slows business down and we can't handle that. So let's look at how this fits in with some other architecture. So go ahead, Justin.
No, I was just going to add on to that to me, one of the things that's been fascinating about the verifiable credential space, since it started, is that we're really taking another swing at reinventing X509 certificates when you dig down into it. The whole PKI structure that we all know and love, or at least deal with, was invented for a disconnected world. Fundamentally, the whole idea is that you have a certificate authority, and then you can trace the chain back to that authority in an offline way to know whether or not that certificate is valid. Of course, we're not applying them in an offline world, and so we have OCSP, we have CRLs, we have all of this technology to basically certificate pinning, like Richard mentioned before. We have all of this technology to say, like, oh wait, no, really, I need something that's more up to date in its presentation that tells me about revocation status and all this other kind of stuff that I can figure out. And with VCs, we as an identity community kind of looked at the the data carrying portion of X509 and, that data associated with the keys and said, what does that look like in an online world? What does that look like when I can give you a dynamic presentation that's not the same every time? Because if you get down to it, if you're sending an X509 cert, you're sending the same document to every single person. And that's going to be there for the life of that certificate, which might be years, especially in case of a of a personal certificate. So you look in the U.S. federal government, personal identity verification or PIV cards are issued with a 6-year life cycle. So if you have to change your name or your email address or your affiliation, you now have a credential that has a 6-year lifetime that might be invalidated within 2 months of it being issued. That leads to some certain architectural issues. VCs, on the other hand, are meant to be shorter lived and presented in an online sort of online aware space, and also meant to are really designed to allow for limited data disclosure, which really helps them apply in this case that we're talking about, and I know we're about to get into a little bit more, of introducing the user and sort of proofing the user into the wider system. So instead of this notion of like, oh, we saw Richard once 5 years ago and he was Richard then, and so here's that same document that 1,000 other sites have seen and you can verify that too. With a VC style ecosystem, we're really embracing the fact that, you know what, the lifetime of issuance of these things really ought to be shorter, and the lifetime of presentation of these things really should be a lot tighter. And that allows us to work in a more dynamic space than we were previously really able to address. So to me, that's sort of the key fundamental exciting piece to this.
I completely agree. That's really valuable perspective. So we recognize there's a lot of tools that try to move people towards this dynamic, easy to evolve future. So we're comparing all these tools against that default OAuth, OpenID Connect. Maybe you're still a SAML organization. And then you're federating between your different identity providers using SCIM, which encodes that data you're going to move between IDPs. And this is great because it's used everywhere. It's what everybody does. Every enterprise software package supports it. But like we talked about, that centralized trust model makes things inflexible. The fact there are lots of extensions is great, but it also means there's a lot to figure out, especially with with OAuth. And it can be fragile, it can be flexible. That changing that IDP becomes a risk to the entire enterprise. So verifiable credentials we talked about. Users share their own information about themselves in a tamper-proof way. That gives you that flexible domain, that flexible trust model, especially when you move between domains. But I have to admit, this is fairly new. There's limited integrations. Existing tools aren't really built around this. Now, the integration is usually not too bad. It's a REST API. Our customers don't seem to struggle with that too much. But it is a hurdle. It's not plug and play the way OpenID Connect is. Now, when we have these conversations, frequently I'm asked, and this, Justin, is where I look to you, because you wrote half these standards. So people often say, well, how does this fit to shared signals? Now, I know shared signals is, I think it's a W3C, or it's an OpenID standard.
It's OpenID Foundation, and some of the parts of it live in the IETF.
Okay,
the standards organizations, the way that they all relate to each other, that could be a whole seminar on its own.
Completely makes sense. So here, it's all about, when we talk about zero trust, part of that is that dynamic response, and being able to get the events between, collect all those events into a security, a SCIM, a SCIM, where we can correlate all those responses and react, change our policy. And it also helps you to get that information to the endpoint so they know how to respond. So I think it's a very good standard. It's tailored for that use case. It does it well. It's the only use case it manages, so it doesn't solve the whole problem, but it's a very important piece of it. So everybody should know how to use it. But I do recognize different companies have implemented their own extensions that aren't always compatible, and it can't get super fine-grained before it gets unwieldy. So those are some of the weaknesses. But in general, it does seem like a standard everybody should be using, everybody should know about. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a set of standards that are really designed to solve a related set of use cases around just kind of letting a distributed architecture know kind of what's going on. So if an RP in a system, it's relying party in a system, figures out that, hey, this Richard character is looking a little shifty. We're not sure if this is actually Richard, what's going on. it'd be really great if that RP could actually tell other people about that. And our federation protocols and even VC protocols and stuff, presentation protocols, aren't set up with solving that. They aren't set up with sort of passing that type of information about, like, hey, I started a session and other people that trust what I say should be able to learn that I started a session, or I am going to turn off that account because something funny was happening. Maybe you want to do something with that, maybe you don't. And the thing that's great about shared signals is this flexibility that allows you to sort of make that interpretation. As we were saying at the beginning, every application gets to kind of decide what does it mean to them when that message comes in. Now, the downside of this is, of course, you need to set up the trust between the applications in a way that is hopefully privacy preserving, that allows them to pass these signals to each other without necessarily just blasting every single thing that a user ever does on every system. Not only that, but we've also seen in practice that a lot of large-scale providers are more than happy to accept signals from outside, but are very loath to give signals to other people about what they think is going on. And so the trust relationship is highly asymmetrical. And I think that the community, in the time that we've had shared signals and risk and CAPE and all of the sort of the extensions and applications of this out there, has really kind of realized that and kind of embraced the fact that, like, these different pieces care about different things at different times. So yeah, you are going to see a lot of sort of localized extensions, but I don't think that that's necessarily a downside. It does make it less of a universal sort of trust boundary protocol than it might seem to have been on the surface.
That's really valuable. So the next one is user managed access. This comes from the Kantar initiative, I think 2017.
Sounds right, yeah.
And it's really valuable in repositioning those access policies to be based on the resource owner. Instead of having to everything go through the IDP, the resource owner says, here's who I want to share this with. And that's great. It provides that granular access, allows that asynchronous response. But most users struggle with sharing, managing that access, especially in a fine-grained way. And it just hasn't seen much adoption. It seems to me, when I'm looking at limited time as an identity practitioner, user managed access, I can solve the same problems using OpenID or using OAuth or using verifiable credentials. Do you think user managed access is an area where we need to invest in understanding and deploying, or do you think there are better ways to meet that same need?
So user managed access, or UMA, as the work group tended to call it, is a really fascinating project because it set out to challenge some of OAuth's core assumptions. In that, in OAuth, there is a single resource owner. And that might be a person, it might be an entity. OAuth is famously very hand-wavy about a lot of these deployment type decisions. But UMA explicitly said, like, okay, not only is there a resource owner, there's also a requesting party, and the protocol is deliberately built to allow them to not be the same entity. And so I think that with UMA, there's a lot of things that we can learn from that structure. Though I agree that the protocol itself has seen limited adoption, because I think that it solved a lot of problems in interesting ways, but ended up not being in the way that the world shifted to. So one of the core assumptions that UMA had was that users should be allowed to bring their own authorization server to a resource. And it turns out pretty much no resource server anywhere is happy about that. So that's a part of UMA that a lot of really good engineering and really good thought went into, but just ultimately didn't align with the security expectations that people have in deploying systems. So it's one of these projects that I think there's a ton we can learn from, but not necessarily like go grab and deploy it today.
That's exactly the kind of guidance I was looking for. That's really valuable. Next one is GNAP, Grant Negotiation Authorization Protocol. Now, you explained this to me. It allows you to do that multi-party delegated authorization. It's kind of like a future OAuth, addresses a lot of the concerns that currently it takes a whole bunch of OAuth extensions to handle. But it's also fairly new, so it doesn't integrate everywhere yet. How would you characterize, when should we look to OAuth and when should we be using GNAP?
So GNAP, once again, kind of like UMA, set out to question a lot of the core assumptions of OAuth and kind of ask the question, like, if we were building a tool to solve all of these use cases that OAuth does and a bunch of use cases that had been kind of nipping around the edges of OAuth at the time that OAuth couldn't really solve very well, multi-party delegation being one of them, ephemeral clients being another one, fine-grained access being another one. With GNAP, we set out to say, like, what would a system look like that can do all of these things? And so we built it and published the standard protocol. And what's been interesting with GNAP is that it has seen limited adoption, similar to UMA, in places where the connection to a legacy OAuth system wasn't a specifically valuable thing. So there wasn't an existing OAuth ecosystem that people needed to tie into directly, so they didn't have an OAuth authorization server that they needed to tie to, or anything like that. What we see, though, is that places like the Open Payments Network in Europe, they're able to use the advanced features of GNAP that fit really well with their use cases and not be tied to the assumptions that OAuth brings to the table. And so one of the other interesting things about GNAP is that since its publication, and really even during the time that we were working on it in the IETF, bits and pieces of GNAP have actually been backported to OAuth as part of that ever-growing family of extensions that Richard mentioned. I have absolutely lost count of the number of extensions and profiles and various bits and bobs and add-ons that the OAuth ecosystem has grown over the years, which I think is ultimately a testament to kind of the mindset of, like, create a core set of reusable components and sort of embrace this composability. There are some downsides to that as too, with the often incompatible combinations you have of things. And again, that's the type of stuff that we were trying to solve more directly in GNAP. But with OAuth, interestingly, these different aspects are being backported in various ways. Most concretely, OAuth has a version of GNAP's access model. So one of the things that I found as a developer and API security designer over the years is that OAuth scopes are very coarse-grained, and it's very difficult to say, especially at runtime, the kinds of things that you want to be able to do. So, like, okay, so I can give you read access to my photos, but what if I want to give you just read access to the metadata of a specific photo for a day? Like, I don't really have a way to describe that request as a client. Now, I could bake in a policy or something like that so that the access token has those rights associated with that. But there was no way to really drill down to that level of specificity when the client was talking to the AS, and no real standard way to do that when looking at the information that was available in the token. That was one of the core pillars that GNAP set out to solve, and our solution, we as a community ended up backporting that into OAuth 2 as rich authorization requests, or RAR. And funny thing about that is that in GNAP, this is like the core principle. Everything is like built around this, and it's just a very, very basic part of how the whole thing works. In OAuth, it has to sit next to scopes. It has to sit next to the resource parameter. It has to sit next to the two versions of the audience parameter that have been defined over the years, and all the various policy extensions and token exchanges and things like that. So the community is currently still struggling exactly how to patch it in, how to patch RAR into all of these different places in ways that make sense. There's even a draft right now that that is being proposed in the OAuth working group for how can a resource server say, oh, hey, here's a fine-grained way to specify like what you need to access over here. Both UMA and GNAP like solved that problem natively. We saw that coming in both of those projects. So now the sort of the wider, larger OAuth community is saying like, hey, that is a problem that we have. And so we're now figuring out what that looks like in this like much messier in a good way space that OAuth exists in. So this is a very long way of saying that if you have to live in the in sort of the messy world of reality and existing systems, OAuth makes a lot of sense, and OAuth plus extensions is going to get you very, very far. If you're not bound by that legacy and you have a chance to kind of step out into your own space, or you're really looking for your own ecosystem, GNAP does a lot of things natively really, really well that OAuth is still catching up to. So that's, to me, is really where I would draw the line between the two today. They're both very capable protocols.
Really helpful guidance. Thank you. So now we shift to look at workload identity. Everything we talked about authenticating resources or authenticating people accessing resources. But like we've said, we want a minimal session, minimal access. And so if we can provide identity to a specific flow, then it becomes much easier to enforce and to make sure it's turned off at the end, but it can also move between machines. So SPIFFE is the standard for doing that. Most people have heard of SPIFFE. They say SPIFFE SPIRE. SPIRE is the open source implementation of SPIFFE, but there are other implementations of SPIFFE. And the goal here is short-lived authentication. It federates against trust domains within a specific infrastructure. It has seen a lot of adoption with cloud-native providers. However, it does require you to set up the certificate authority, the different agent deployments, so there's a little more work there. And it like when we talked about, it doesn't solve the user-facing piece. It's just one part of the problem, like when we talked about SSE. So that's kind of the pros and cons. But it does seem to be getting a lot of adoption now, and it does seem to meet that use case quite well. What advice do you have, Justin, for when people should be adopting SPIFFE?
Yeah, the no user-facing flows, I think, is a great point, because to me, that focus is actually ultimately a strength of SPIFFE. I think you should be wary of any protocol or system that claims that it's just going to solve all your problems across your whole stack. But that is a limitation, perhaps more so than a weakness, of SPIFFE, in that it is really very tightly designed around machine identity. And going back to the let's reinvent X509 again discussion, we're doing a little bit of that with SPIFFE, but this time in sort of the CSR side of the world. Because what happens in SPIFFE is that you get a new piece of software that wakes up, and it needs to have an identity that it can recognize itself by and that other systems can recognize it by, credentials to prove that identity, but also, importantly, a trust root whereby it can recognize other trusted entities within that system. And that sort of triumvirate is what SPIFFE solved. Back in the day, back when I started, setting up servers and whatnot, what would you do to get a TLS, or actually then would have been SSL server on your system? Well, you go and you generate a key pair on the device, on the system itself. You create a certificate signing request, and then you copy that file over to your CA, and then some administrator goes and looks at that, makes sure that you are the person that owns that server, and they click OK, and then you get back a signed version of your public key that identifies your server, and then you install that file onto your server, and then you're good to go. This is great if your server lives for years at a time, and you're probably not going to be rotating this. Back to the whole idea of, PIV certificates live for 6 years by default, right? Because the process is so hard, we put a lot of effort into making sure that this is a very slow, deliberate thing. And then because it's so hard, we want those things to live for a long time. SPIFFE was just like, okay, a workload is something that spins up and down within seconds, at perhaps less. So that process is out the window. That doesn't work at all. Even something like Acme, which is what powers Let's Encrypt, that a lot of folks are probably familiar with, that protocol is drastically orders of magnitude too slow for a workload type environment. So what SPIFFE basically sought out to do was like, okay, within these cloud environments, we can actually recognize the software. And in doing that recognition, we can provide identity. We can project that identity into the system. And importantly, also tell it, these are the things that you trust. And so that's how a set of workloads can sort of know about each other within a trust domain, because the system that they sort of exist in tells them, these are the rules of the system that you're in right now. Software doesn't really get to pick that, and it doesn't need to.
Yeah, that's really, and that distinction between long-lived certificates, even Acme, which aren't like terribly long-lived.
No, they can be hours at a time, but hours is forever for a workload.
Exactly. I think I missed, reading through the documentation of SPIFFE, you kind of missed that distinction, so that's really good. Now, the last... Oh, go ahead.
Before we move on from SPIFFE, because I think that this is interesting to the overall discussion here. The SPIFFE community has a really great book called "Solving the Bottom Turtle," using the old metaphor of trust is just turtles all the way down. And this is I think really important to go back to that question now of zero trust in what. And the whole idea of SPIFFE is that, you're trusting this, this sidecar that gets deployed, this agent that gets deployed. You're trusting the node attester. You're trusting the cloud platform. You're trusting all of these things. But what you're not trusting is for that instance to be able to live and hold a certificate long enough that somebody goes and copies in at runtime. You're not trusting it to be able to attest to itself about its identity, and you're not trusting the network connections between these workloads because you're setting up the ability for them to encrypt to each other, to authenticate to each other. So it is all about where you are drawing that particular boundary. And SPIFFE allows us to be, in the workload space, very opinionated about all of that.
You always see Agne light up when someone makes a book recommendation. She'll probably have it read by next week. That's so. Our last one is I understand that one of the challenges of SPIFFE is that each organization, they define what's going to be trusted within their organization, but there's no way to move between infrastructure environments, between trust models. And so that's where you have to fall back to OAuth for longer lived identity. My understanding is WIMSE, I think, is an IETF conversation that's going on to talk about adding those capabilities to SPIFFE. I don't know. WIMSE comes up all the time, but I'm not exactly sure how it fits in. How do you, please guide us, Justin.
Yeah, so WIMSE, this is kind of, WIMSE is a little bit different from the other entries on this list because WIMSE is not a protocol. I'm one of the co-chairs of the WIMSE working group in the IETF, and we founded WIMSE specifically to look at what are the gaps in workload identity systems, especially when you're working across different trust domains and across different cloud environments. So I can have a SPIFFE identity that spins up, and my attester can do all of its trusted things and give me keys and all of that. But then I need to go talk to a workload that lives somewhere else. Suddenly I need to be able to have something that can bridge that gap. And so what WIMSE is really setting out to do is sort of collect the conversations and technologies and approaches that allow workloads to live in this sort of multidimensional space where they can talk to each other outside of these individual trust boundaries. And so instead of being a single protocol in WIMSE, we've got a suite of documents about identity documents and presentation of proof of those documents and the keys that sort of come along with that, the identifier formats that go with that. And a lot of it is deliberately designed to be, compatible with or a superset of the things in the SPIFFE community. Because one of the things that happened when WIMSE was founded was the SPIFFE community already existed, but it was sort of hitting the edges of the set of use cases that they knew that they wanted to solve. And they really try to, they try to make sure that they're not, the SPIFFE community really tries to make sure that they're not letting the scope creep out into other spaces that it wasn't designed for. And WIMSE was founded to be like, okay, we're not solving the SPIFFE use case, node attestation and onboard agents and all of that other stuff. We're trying to solve things that once you have that, what does that mean? What can you do about that within an environment, across different environments? How does this touch up against OAuth? When you're calling, an external service, where does that fit in? How does this, work across things like, HTTP-based systems where you can use things like message signatures and not just mutual TLS? And yeah, I think that there's a lot of interesting work there, but it is harder to categorize because it's all about addressing the gaps in other systems when you're looking at workload identity.
That'll be a very valuable set of best practices when it's completed. Pierce asked if there's about DIDCOM. Just so you know, Pierce, I thought about putting an entry for DIDCOM, but I decided it fits under the verifiable credentials space. At some point, we probably should have a why use DIDCOM versus OpenID and how they interrelate or other verifiable credential exchange protocols. But that's why I didn't include it here. But yes, thank you, Justin, for giving us that helping fill in the gaps in my analysis here. And hopefully this card's really valuable for people to get an overview of what they need to know about.
This was very valuable for me. I'm usually, like, when you're reading standards, it's all abbreviations and tables like the one that Richard did, but Justin, you did a very good job at actually explaining how it relates to what's happening in my computer and in the systems. I recognize there's not a lot of time, and I saw that Pierce asked a question about AI agents, and I of course had one as well. It's my favorite topic, and I keep saying it. I don't think you're allowed on the internet and do a podcast anymore if you don't mention those. So this is mostly a question for Justin. We talked a lot about the users, and users now are likely gonna be AI agents. So in your opinion, how should we think about identity and trust when the entity isn't human?
There is a lot of weight behind that question, Agne, to be clear, I'm not faulting you for putting that there, because I think that we are, as an industry, as an identity and security industry, struggling to figure out where these new paradigms fit within the structures that we already have. So I would actually push back on the notion that users are going to be agents, because I think that we have used user as a stand-in for a lot of things that we actually care about. Had this discussion with somebody recently who made the assertion that, I can't authorize you until I authenticate you, and that's actually just not true at all. I can be authorized to do lots of different things that have nothing to do with my identity. I can be authorized to buy a pack of gum at the store because I have money, right? If I give the money to the cashier, then I am authorized to buy the pack of gum. If I don't give the money to the cashier, I am not authorized to buy the pack of gum. Nothing about that has to do with authentication. And I think that in our digital systems, we don't really embrace that type of expressivity in the way that we really ought. And to be fair, it's hard to do. It is really hard to do. But I think that that's a space that we really ought to be pushing ourselves into as an industry. So with that in mind, I think that what we're seeing with these agentic systems is that they take some aspects that are humanish And so we try to hit them with the same hammers that we hit our human-shaped problems with. And they're also workload-ish. So we also hit them with the hammers that we hit our workload-shaped problems with. And there's some fantastic work from Peter Castleman and others that about what are the workload type aspects of agentic systems. I think there's a lot of really good stuff to that. Quick plug for the WIMSE working group. We're having an interim working group meeting next week to talk about that work specifically, because there is, there's a lot of overlap, but it's not complete overlap, because the unpredictability of these systems is different. The way that we think about capturing intent is different. And a really brilliant person in this space, George Fletcher, has got me thinking recently about a lot of systems we model with on behalf of semantics, and I hear that a lot in the agentic systems. Like, oh, this agent is acting on behalf of Richard or on behalf of Agne. But here's the thing: it might not actually be acting on my behalf. It might be acting for my benefit. And there's a subtle semantic difference there, in that it's not doing something that I would have done on my own and I'm just getting a tool to do it for me. It's doing something that I might not have done on my own and I might not have had the capability to do on my own directly before, but the system is deciding that it is to my benefit that this happens. And it's that still has ramifications for the auditability of this, the observability of this, and the liability of this when things inevitably go sideways and something decides that it is to my benefit for it to do something that I absolutely don't want to happen. And so I think that the agentic systems are really pushing us to question our fundamentals in a new way that we haven't seen in this industry for a while. And I think that there's not a clean mapping to any of our existing stuff.
But your point about on behalf of is a very useful way to think about AI agents acting, with delegated authority. But for the benefit of is another way to think about delegated authority that we hadn't previously considered. That's very insightful. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, and in case this got cut off, all credit to George Fletcher for that particular insight, and a lot of good work that is being done in the OpenID Foundation for the Death in the Digital Estate working group is pushing the semantics of what identity and access and delegation mean in the human space and how that can be modeled in the digital space. I think that agents are pushing that same set of conversations in a different direction. The other space where I think the agentic systems are really pushing us as an industry is the ephemerality of systems. So workloads are ephemeral, but they're kind of contained. WIMSE defines a workload as software acting for a specific purpose. I don't think we can do that to an agent in quite the same way. It's acting with a particular intent by somebody else, but not necessarily for a specific purpose, at least not one that we can predict ahead of time. And that, to me, is a fascinating difference, because we're starting to see adoption of technologies like CIMD in the OAuth space. I think GNAP actually solves a lot of the ephemeral introduction and discovery stuff in a very clean way that I think we'll see adapted into other protocol spaces as well. And but agents are doing it in a different way with different assumptions.
Interesting. Thank you, Justin. Something to think about as well and evaluate. It's a topic we talk a lot about, and we have our own wheelhouse, but it's always interesting to hear and understand the wider world around us. I know that we're at time. I have one quick question just to kind of round out and go back to the zero trust topic that we had. So, Justin, I also want to ask it of you. So, if you were starting fresh now, what would a zero trust native identity architecture actually look like? And what's different from what most organizations have today?
Well, I would start by asking you, what is it that you want to have zero trust in? And then we can have the conversation from there. If we can't answer that question, which is a complex question to answer, then anything else is just solving a problem that we haven't fully articulated. And I think that, as technologists, the most important thing that we can ever do is fall in love with the problem and sort of, guide the solutions to that problem where they fit best.
Perfect.
So sorry, it's probably not the concrete answer you were looking for, but I do think that you should always start with a question.
I will quote Tim from the chat. Excellent answer. So thank you so much, Justin. I will not keep you longer. I have lots of questions, but maybe we can do a follow-up webinar in the future. So it's always good to have something left over.
That would be great. I'd be happy to come back. Thank you for having me on today.
Thank you.
Always insightful. I learn a lot every conversation.
Thanks, Richard.